The snow wasn't just falling, it was a living thing, a predator that clawed at her face and stole the breath from her lungs. Each gasp was a shard of ice. Lena ran, her thin gray dress a poor shield against the biting fury of the high mountain winter. The bright red scarf her mother had given her, a final desperate gift of hope and color, was a banner of defiance against the endless white. But defiance was a poor fuel, and hers was burning out. Behind her, somewhere in the swirling blizzard, were the sounds of men. Not their voices, not any more. The storm had swallowed their curses and their calls. Now it was just the unnatural crunch of heavy boots on snow, a rhythm of pursuit that beat in time with her own failing heart. They were hunters, and she was their quarry. Her feet, wrapped in rags inside worn-out shoes, were numb things she no longer trusted. She stumbled, fell, and pushed herself back up, her hands raw and bleeding from the frozen crust of the snow. The trees were skeletal giants, their bare branches reaching for her, snagging at her clothes and hair. This was not the golden country she had been promised. This was a frozen hell, and she was running out of time, running out of hope, running out of world. Then, through the blinding curtain of white, she saw it. A flicker of orange light, impossibly warm, impossibly real. A cabin, tucked into the lee of a great stone cliff face, smoke pluming from its chimney like a prayer. It could be a trap. It could be them. But the alternative was to lie down here and let the snow become her shroud. With the last dregs of her strength, she pushed forward, her legs moving on memory alone. The light grew stronger, a beacon in the encroaching twilight. She reached the small porch, her hand brushing against the rough-hewn logs of the wall, and then her body gave its final command. She collapsed, the world dissolving into a merciful blackness, the red of her scarf bleeding into the pristine white of a stranger's doorstep. He found her folded into the snow like a broken doll. Owen had been checking his trap lines when the storm turned vicious, forcing him back to the shelter of his cabin. He was a man built of the mountain itself, broad-shouldered and immense, with a cascade of dark, untamed hair and a beard thick with frost. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before dusk, missed nothing. He saw the small figure, the splash of red against the gray dress, and moved with a speed that belied his great size. He knelt, his huge, calloused hand gently brushing the snow from her face. She was so small, so pale, her skin almost translucent. For a moment he thought she was already gone, another soul claimed by the indifference of the peaks. But then a faint cloud of vapor escaped her lips. She was alive. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, kicking the thick wooden door shut against the storm's howl. The cabin was a single room, Spartan but clean, smelling of pine smoke, curing leather, and something else. Solitude. A fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A bed of thick furs lay in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. He laid her gently on the rug before the fire, her slight frame a stark contrast to the ruggedness of his world. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, his movements deliberate and sure. He carefully removed her frozen shoes and the sodden rags wrapped around her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined the angry red of her frostbitten skin. He fetched a bowl of snow and began to rub her feet and hands, the cold friction a painful but necessary step to restoring circulation. She moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. He paused, looking down at her face, a canvas of exhaustion and fear. He didn't know who she was or what had driven her into the heart of a blizzard, but he knew one thing. The mountain had brought her to him, and he would not let it claim her now. As warmth slowly seeped back into her limbs, consciousness returned in painful, disorienting waves. Lena's first sensation was the crackle of a fire. Her second, the weight of a heavy wool blanket covering her. She opened her eyes, and the world swam into focus. She was lying on a soft bearskin rug, the fire's heat a blissful comfort on her frozen skin. And then she saw him. He was sitting in a chair across the room, watching her, his expression unreadable. The sheer scale of him was terrifying. He was a giant, a creature of myth who had stepped out of the dark woods and into this small, warm space. His presence filled the cabin, leaving little room for air. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as a jolt of pain shot through her feet. "Easy." His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "You were half frozen. Your feet'll hurt for a while." He didn't move from his chair, as if sensing that any closer approach would shatter her fragile composure. He held a steaming mug in his hands. He nodded toward it. "Broth, when you're ready." Lee Na said nothing. She simply watched him, her mind racing. This was her life now, a series of unknowns, each more frightening than the last. She remembered the journey across the great ocean, the promises of a good job, a new beginning. She remembered the man in the city, Mr. Finch, his smile thin and cruel, his eyes like chips of flint. He had paid for her passage, and he had come to collect his due. She was not to be a seamstress. She was property, destined for a grim life in a mining camp's saloon, her future sold before she had even set foot on this new soil. The escape had been an impulse, a desperate flight into the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the red scarf that was her last link to a life that was gone forever. Had this man saved her only to become another captor? The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. It became a world unto itself, suspended in time and space, surrounded by the ceaseless roar of the wind. Owen moved with a quiet rhythm that seemed to sync with the mountain's breathing. He tended the fire, prepared simple meals of dried meat and broth, and treated Lee Na's frostbitten hands and feet with a salve made from pine resin and bear grease that smelled of the deep forest. He rarely spoke, but his silence was not unkind. It was watchful, patient. He gave her space, never crowding her, never demanding answers to the questions that must have been burning in his mind. Lee Na remained wary, a frightened animal cornered and ready to bolt. She ate the food he offered, her eyes never leaving him, flinching at any sudden movement. On the second day, the tension outside began to creep in. A sharp cracking sound from the woods made Owen freeze, his head tilting as he listened. It was just a snow-laden branch giving way, but the change in him was palpable. His calm watchfulness sharpened into a predator's focus. He rose and went to the single window, peering out into the white chaos. He stood there for a long time, a massive silhouette against the gray light. Later, he took a heavy bar of wood and secured it across the door, a simple act that sent a fresh wave of fear through Lee Na. He was not just keeping the storm out, he was barring the door against something else. The hunters. The knowledge settled in her stomach like a cold stone. They had not given up. They were out there, somewhere in that howling maelstrom, and this small cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and they were both trapped inside it. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken fears. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and somewhere outside, evil was patiently waiting for the storm to break. On the third morning, the wind died down to a mournful whisper. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the storm's fury. A fragile peace settled over the mountains, the world outside blanketed in a thick, undisturbed layer of fresh snow. Owen was already awake, standing by the window, his posture rigid. He had been there all night, a silent guardian. Lee Na sat up, pulling the heavy blanket around her shoulders. The quiet was broken by a sudden, sharp bark. It wasn't a wolf. It was a dog, the sound alien and intrusive in this wild place. Owen turned from the window, his expression grim. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. It was not a question. A few minutes later, 3 figures emerged from the tree line, dark shapes moving slowly against the blinding white. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin. One man, taller and thinner than the others, stepped forward. Even from this distance, Lee Na recognized the cruel set of his shoulders. Finch. He shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the still, cold air. "Owen, we know you're in there. We tracked the girl to your door. Send her out." Owen did not move, did not answer. He simply watched them. Finch waited, then tried a different tactic. "There's a bounty on her. $500. Says she's a thief. But I'll make you a better offer. $100, cash, right now, just for the girl. No trouble for you. You can go back to your mountain and we can all forget this happened." The offer hung in the air, a tempting poison. $100 was a fortune to a man who lived off the land. It was the price of his solitude, the cost of non-involvement. Lee Na's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Owen, this strange, silent giant who had saved her from the storm. She saw the conflict warring in his winter sky eyes. He could give her up. It would be the easy thing to do, the sensible thing. Why would he risk his life for a stranger, a frightened girl who had brought nothing but trouble to his door? This was his moment of truth, and her life depended entirely on the moral compass of a man she barely knew. Owen's gaze shifted from the men outside to Lee Na. He saw the terror in her eyes, the silent plea. He saw not a bounty, not a piece of property, but a human being stripped of everything but her will to survive. He had come to these mountains to escape the cruelty of men like Finch, to live by a simpler, cleaner code. To hand her over would be to betray not just her, but the very solitude he had built to protect what was left of his own soul. He turned back to the window, his voice a low growl that carried across the snow. "She's not for sale." The words were an earthquake, shattering the fragile peace. Finch's laughter was a dry, ugly sound. "Have it your way, mountain man, but we're not leaving without what's mine." The standoff began. The two men with Finch fanned out, their rifles held at the ready. They were confident, used to getting what they wanted through force and intimidation. They saw one man in a log cabin. They did not see the mountain itself standing with him. Owen moved away from the window, his mind working quickly. He looked around his small home, not as a shelter, but as a fortress. He pointed to the trap door leading to the small root cellar. "Get down there and stay quiet," he commanded Lee Na. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear for him. "Go," he repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. She scrambled down the ladder, pulling the heavy door shut above her. In the darkness below, she could hear the muffled sounds from above, the crunch of boots drawing closer, a heavy thud against the door. Then Finch's voice again, this time right outside. "Last chance, Owen. Open this door or we'll burn it down around you." Lee Na huddled in the cold, dark cellar, listening to the sounds of the confrontation above. She heard Owen's heavy footsteps pacing, the scrape of the table being moved to barricade the door. This man, this stranger, was choosing to fight for her. He was risking everything for her. The thought was both terrifying and profoundly moving. She was no longer just a victim running from her fate. She was the cause of a battle between two kinds of men, one who saw people as objects to be owned, and one who saw a life worth defending. The assault on the cabin began with a brutal splintering sound as an axe bit deep into the wooden door. Each thud vibrated through the floorboards, a drumbeat of imminent violence. Lee Na, huddled in the root cellar, pressed her hands over her ears. Above her, Owen was not idle. He moved with a grim purpose, not of a man preparing for a fight, but of an animal defending its lair. He overturned the heavy oak table, bracing it against the weakening door. He doused the main fire in the hearth, leaving only a small, controlled pile of embers. The main room was plunged into a shadowy twilight, making him a harder target. The axe blows continued, relentless. Wood groaned and split. A small hole appeared, then another. Finch's voice sneered through the opening. "It's over, mountain man. You can't hide in there forever." But Owen wasn't hiding. He was waiting. When the door finally gave way with a screech of tortured wood, the two hired men burst in, rifles raised. They were met not with gunfire, but with a cloud of thick, choking smoke. Owen had thrown a bundle of damp pine needles onto the embers, filling the cabin with an acrid, blinding screen. The men coughed, their eyes streaming. In the confusion, a massive shape lunged from the shadows. Owen moved like a force of nature, a bear roused from its slumber. He slammed one man against the wall with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs and send his rifle clattering to the floor. He disarmed the other with a swift, powerful blow to the wrist. The fight was brutal, primal, and short. Finch, who had remained outside, watched in disbelief as his men were thrown from the cabin like sacks of grain, landing hard in the snow. Owen stood in the shattered doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He was not armed with a gun, but his sheer presence was a weapon. He pointed a finger not at Finch, but at the steep, snow-laden slope that loomed directly above them. He let out a roar, a deep, guttural sound that was less human and more a part of the mountain itself. The vibration, combined with the morning sun warming the new snow, was enough. A low rumble started, growing into a deafening crash as a wave of white power cascaded down the slope, a controlled avalanche that buried the path back down the mountain and sent Finch and his recovering men scrambling for their lives. They were cut off, trapped. Owen didn't wait to see the outcome. He wrenched open the cellar door. "Come on, now!" He pulled Lee Nye out and dragged her towards the back of the cabin, where a small, hide-covered opening was hidden behind a stack of firewood. It was a bolt hole, an escape route he had built for just such an occasion. They scrambled out into the cold, leaving the broken cabin and the stranded hunters behind, and fled deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. They ran until their lungs burned, plunging into the silent, snow-choked forest. The immediate danger was behind them, but they were now exiles in the frozen wild with no shelter and a storm threatening to return. They found refuge as night fell in a shallow cave carved into a rock face, shielded from the wind by a thick stand of ancient pines. Owen managed to start a small, smokeless fire. They huddled together, exhausted and freezing. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the stark reality of their situation. Lee Na looked at this man who had sacrificed his home for her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. In a voice barely above a whisper, choked with emotion and fear, she asked the question that held the entire weight of her past and her uncertain future. "Where will I sleep?" Owen looked at her, his expression softening. He reached over and unfastened the thick bearskin cloak from his own shoulders. He laid it carefully over the driest part of the cave floor. "You'll sleep here," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "You take the furs. I'll keep the fire going. I'll watch over you." In that simple answer, in that selfless act, Lee Na's life was irrevocably changed. It was not an answer about logistics. It was a promise of protection, a declaration of respect, an offering of humanity in a world that had shown her none. For the first time since she had left her home, she felt safe. They stayed in the cave for days, waiting for the threat to pass and for the weather to stabilize. The small space became a world of its own, a pocket of warmth and quiet in the vast, cold wilderness. The shared danger had stripped away all pretense, leaving only a raw and honest connection between them. In the flickering firelight, they began to share pieces of themselves. Lee Na, her voice soft, told him about her village by the sea, about the family she had left behind, and about the dream of a better life that had turned into a nightmare. She spoke of her fear, but also of a resilience she never knew she possessed. Owen, in turn, spoke for the first time of his own past, He had not always been a man of the mountains. He had once had a wife, a small farm in the valley below. But a fever had swept through the territory, taking her from him, leaving him hollowed out by grief. He had retreated into the high peaks, seeking a silence that could match the silence in his own heart. "The world of men," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames, "has too many sharp edges." He showed her how to find dry kindling under the snow, how to read the tracks of animals, how to listen to the language of the forest. He taught her not how to survive, but how to belong to the mountain, just as he did. She, in turn, brought a quiet grace to their Spartan existence. She mended a tear in his coat with a needle and thread she had kept hidden in the hem of her dress. She showed him how to brew a soothing tea from pine needles. They were small acts, but they were the threads that began to weave their two solitary lives together. One afternoon, Owen returned from a scouting trip, his expression unreadable. He had found tracks. Finch and his men had retreated, their trail leading back down towards the lowlands. The immediate threat was gone, but their own situation remained perilous. His cabin was destroyed, his supplies scattered. They could not stay in the cave forever. He had found something else, though. A place. An old trapper's line cabin, abandoned for years, nestled in a hidden valley even higher up the mountain. It was remote, difficult to reach, and almost impossible to find by chance. It was a place to start again. The journey to the hidden valley was arduous. They climbed higher into the heart of the mountains, into a world of pristine snow and silent, ancient trees. The air grew thin and cold, but with every step, Lena felt a growing sense of liberation. She was not running from something anymore. She was moving towards something. The abandoned cabin was small and rough, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but to them it was a palace. It was a sanctuary they could claim as their own. Together they worked to make it a home. Owen, with his immense strength, repaired the collapsed section of the roof and rebuilt the crumbling stone hearth. Lena, with her meticulous care, cleaned every corner, chinked the log walls with moss and mud to keep out the wind, and used what little they had to bring a sense of order and warmth to the space. The red scarf, her last link to her old life, she hung carefully on the wall, not as a sad reminder, but as a splash of vibrant color, a promise of a new beginning. As the days turned into weeks, a gentle, unspoken romance blossomed between them. It was not a romance of grand declarations, but of quiet moments. It was in the way he would place a hot stone wrapped in cloth at her feet while she slept. It was in the way she would save the best piece of roasted rabbit for him. It was in a shared look across the fire, a silent understanding that spoke more than words ever could. She began to see past the intimidating giant and saw the gentle, wounded heart of the man beneath. He, in turn, saw not a fragile victim, but a woman of incredible strength and spirit, whose presence was slowly healing the parts of him he thought were lost forever. One evening, as the soft snow began to fall outside, he was mending a snowshoe by the fire. She came and sat beside him, watching his large, capable hands at work. "Owen," she said softly, the first time she had used his name. He looked up, his work forgotten. "You saved my life." He shook his head, his gaze returning to the snowshoe. "You saved your own life, Lena. You ran. You fought. I just opened the door." But she knew it was more than that. He had not just opened a door. He had opened up a future for her she never could have imagined. She was no longer Finch's property or a runaway. She was a woman of the mountain, strong and free. The long winter began its slow retreat, surrendering the mountain to the persistent warmth of spring. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath. Small, determined flowers pushed their way through the melting drifts, and the sound of running water from thawing streams filled the air. The world was waking up, and with it a sense of possibility. Lena and Owen stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the vast expanse of the lowlands stretching out before them. Towns and settlements were distant smudges on the horizon. The world of men, with all its dangers and all its promises, was within reach again. Lena now had a choice. She could leave. Owen had taught her enough to survive. She could make her way to a town, lose herself in a crowd, and try to build a new life, the kind she had once dreamed of. The path was open to her. Owen stood beside her, his silence a testament to the freedom he was giving her. He would not ask her to stay. He had rescued her from one kind of captivity. He would never impose another. He had found a measure of peace in her presence, a warmth that had thawed his own frozen heart. But he knew that her spirit was too bright to be contained in his small, solitary world unless she chose it for herself. He had given her refuge, and now he was giving her the one thing no one else had, a choice, entirely her own. She looked out at the distant world, then turned her gaze to the rugged peaks around them, the peaks that had once been her prison, but had become her sanctuary. She looked at the man standing beside her, his weathered face etched with a quiet strength and a deep kindness. He was her rescuer, her teacher, her friend. He was her home. She thought of the cold fear of the chase, the brutal indifference of men like Finch, and contrasted it with the simple, profound safety she felt standing here beside him. The world below offered uncertainty. The mountain offered a life that was hard, but it was real, and it was shared. She reached out, and her small hand slipped into his large, calloused one. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of her decision. He looked down at their joined hands, and then at her, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his face, a sight more beautiful than the first sunrise of spring. She did not need to speak the words. He understood. Her choice was made. Her new life had already begun, here on this mountain, with him. The world below could wait.